So I'll cover across the commodities outlook, looking at kind of the bulks, the new energy, base metals, but start off with some of the big picture macro drivers, especially India and China. So I think there's a lot of pessimism, as we were saying yesterday morning, around the commodity markets at the moment, but actually I think there are a lot of good stories that are just underappreciated, and the number one of those is very much India. I've been quite positive on India since COVID, really. Prior to that, early 2000s, we used to have all these Chindia reports in the banking sector saying, India's going to follow China's growth. It's got 1 billion people, lots of potential. But it's never really lived up to that potential, right? We blame it on perhaps the political side or the bureaucracy, or there was a lot of stumbling blocks. It had a lot of promise and was never really delivering. But post-COVID, kind of 22, 23, we're starting to get a lot of feedback from traders and people selling materials into India. And they're all saying, wow, the demand's just really, really strong. Import demand's really stepped up here, and it looks very sustainable. So, what's changed in India? I think 3 major factors. Number one, early on, Modi did that demonetization program, right? Because India used to be a very cash-based society. So they cancelled all the old banknotes, forced them to be paid into banks, everyone opening bank accounts. And subsequent to that, India's gone phenomenally digital. Even the street vendors now are digital payments only. And if you digitize money, then that eliminates a lot of corruption, because the local officials can no longer be putting their hands in the pocket or demanding payoffs for paperwork and stuff. If all that paperwork's digital and online and you don't deal with anyone, then it's very hard to slow that process down from a corruption angle. So that's really streamlined India, as well as from the government perspective of this digitization. A lot of forms, approvals. In the old days, if you wanted to set up a business in India or try and build a factory somewhere, there's so many local bureaucracies you'd have to deal with, state, federal, lots and lots of paperwork. Again, an awful lot of that is now digitized. And as a foreign investor in India, there's actually just one bureau now you deal with in Delhi. They'll do all of the local paperwork in the background for you. So that's another streamline to kind of bring in the FDI and encourage that. They also had bankruptcy reform and a few other financial reforms. So you've got a much better functioning financial system. And the bureaucracy is much improved. Corruption and kind of any stumbling blocks have been much reduced as well. The other big thing is investing in the infrastructure. India always used to suffer terrible blackouts, brownouts. The roads were terrible. The ports were too slow. There's been massive investment in that. State, local, federal level investment all coming together. The infrastructure is much improved. Speaking to people like steel traders or iron ore traders, what used to be a 24-hour trucking journey to get product from one place to a port's now 10 hours. And likewise, the ports, there's so much investment and capacity there. There haven't been blackouts and brownouts in India since about 2019. Got plentiful power, massive renewable investment as well. Go through that shortly. So there's been an awful lot of change, and kind of the groundwork has been laid. And now we're starting to see the fruition in terms of the commodity demand coming through. So the central government budgets as well, infrastructure demand, that's really been driving a lot of the investment, certainly on the steel side of things. The infrastructure budget's been up about 30% every year for the last 3 years. This year, actually going into the election, they were quite responsible, only raised it by another 11%. But you've still got huge plans here. Traveling around India now feels a lot more like China compared to what it used to do. You've got brand new airports in most of the big cities. The highways are much better. The latest one they're doing is on the trains. So they're going to electrify the entire rail network to speed up the trains and everything as well. So that'll be a big structural change. Of course, huge amount of copper cable if you're going to electrify the entire rail network. And India is becoming the first country outside of Japan to use Japanese technology and build a bullet train network. Of course, India geopolitically not so close to China. They don't want to rely on Chinese technology where possible. And Japan, I believe, state level is lending them 80% of the money to build this network. So yeah, no more sitting on the roof at 400 kilometers an hour. Might have to be a bit of a cultural change, but it should be a phenomenally commodity intensive build out, and really should revolutionize a lot of transport in the country, those kind of developments. And then other interesting angles, certainly on the renewable energy. Modi was saying in the election that his aim is to bring free power to all rural households. So then people can freely charge an electric scooter or electric car. So the government started that with a program to install solar panels on 10 million houses for free. The government's running around to the rural areas, freely sticking solar panels on people's roofs. You've got 20 million social houses being built, government housing. So the one thing India doesn't have versus China really is what I call that high-rise living style. One of the big things for China for steel demand is China's phenomenally tightly urbanized. Most people these days live in big tall apartment blocks, heavily steel intensive. India's still quite low rise, the traditional family together in one big house. But that is starting to change in some of the big cities. There's a lot more high-rise developments coming up. Land reform helping to do that as well. So you've got big government investment programs, and of course the other big one is Modi's really running around the world being best mates with everyone, trying to encourage all of the FDI. So obviously member of the BRICS group and trying to bring in money from those guys, is going to kind of the West and saying, we're all kind of worried about China's dominance in things. Why don't you invest in India? We're a fellow freedom-loving democracy. Invest here. So Modi's doing a good job of trying to pull in investment from multiple different sources at the moment, and that is starting off from quite a low base. So India only manufactures about 2% of global goods, consumes about 4%, but that's where we're seeing the real growth, is in the manufacturing base, and that's very bullish for a lot of the base metals like copper and aluminium, which I'll come on to. So in terms of the kind of commodities that are set to benefit, obviously for China's development, the number one winner was iron ore. Just geologically, China had next to no hematite. It's heavily reliant on high-cost magnetite, so that's why China became 80-90% reliant on imported iron ore. Copper as well, big winner from China side of things. Whereas for India, geologically, India has plenty of iron ore. What it doesn't have, of course, is the met coal. So met coal is by far and away the biggest winner from the India story. They're pretty much exclusively reliant on imports of met coal. Copper as well, next to no copper in the country, so it's going to be a huge driver of global copper demand as well. Does have a reasonable amount of bauxite and alumina, a reasonable amount of zinc, so they can produce a bit more of that, but I still think that the demand growth rates are going to be such a degree that India will see increasing imports of those. And the big question mark for India really is on the thermal coal side of things. It's already a very big importer of thermal coal on a global comparison basis, but it's obviously got an awful lot of coal reserves. So Indian coal production actually up about 10% last year, 1.1 billion tons, record high. So it's interesting that panel previously talking about how everyone else in the world and Western world's trying to move away from coal, but global coal production's at a record high last year. Indonesia's churning out over 500 million tons, India's up to 1.1 billion, China's still well over their previous kind of 4 billion ton cap that they were aiming for previously. That's been abandoned. So coal demand absolutely still growing, driven by these countries, even as the Western countries move away from it. But India does have massive investment plans on the renewable energy there, going from 166 gigawatts to 500 gigawatts. And then this is part of the commodity demand, is links back to this Made in India program, the FDI side of things. So Indian government's actually mandated that 75% of the solar panels in India must be manufactured in India by the end of the year. So previously they've all been imported from China. Now they'll still be importing the cells from China initially, but they'll be putting them in the frames manufactured in India. So the aluminium demand will therefore be within India by the end of this year. So massive growth in renewables, obviously kind of from a political standpoint. Modi got the idea of world's moving to this green energy story. We better jump on board, get out there early, say we'll have a 50% renewable target by 2030. But of course, the power demand's growing so quickly, that still means they need an awful lot of fossil fuels. So the thermal generation are going to install another 80 gigawatts of thermal between this year and 2030. So the question with the thermal coal, of course, India's reserves are not that great, right? They're low CV, high ash, not great quality. Importing higher quality, cleaner coal from Australia or South Africa would be environmentally beneficial. But the issue in India is obviously keeping the lights on as cheaply as possible. Coal India's sells for $33 a tonne. It's the government coal price. So the Indian power plants really don't have great interest bringing in even coal from Indonesia at $50, $60 a tonne, let alone Australia or South Africa at $100+. So the coal import question for India is really going to be heavily policy driven. For now, the goal is we want to keep the lights on. We need to keep the power generation growing to encourage the investment and the development. And we want to do that as cheaply as possible. But at some point, could you see a tipping point in India where the environment becomes such a public pressure that they actually start to mandate, no, we'll need to import cleaner quality coal and produce less of our poorer quality coal. But I think thermal coal imports will be very much a policy question for India as to their development in the next 10 years. Whereas met coal, that's something that India just can't live without. Met coal imports, they just have next to none geologically. And you look at the steel market in India, it's about 140 million tonnes of steel production last year, but less than half of that comes from blast furnaces. They still have about 40 million tonnes of induction furnace-based steel making, which, this is the kind of stuff China closed down in about the 2005, the first steel industry policy, eliminating a lot of those kind of smaller charcoal-based, or they tend to be 4 tonnes of carbon or so per tonne of steel versus a blast furnace at 2.2 and sub 1. But yeah, for now, India's very dispersed, very local. So there's still 40 million tonnes of those, which ultimately, at some point down the road, will be uncompetitive and will be replaced. So the Indian steel mills at the moment, certainly they're talking the talk on green steel, as steel makers are globally. But right now, what they're building is just standard blast furnaces. Right, they're desperate for the steel demand growth is there. They're desperate to keep the production up. So we've got 80 million tonnes of blast furnaces under construction in India that'll be coming on by the end of the decade. And generally, they're quite large scale, right? 4,000, 5,000 cubic meter furnaces. They're generally on the coast as well. So easy to import met coal. So India's met coal imports really by the end of the decade could double. It's already the biggest importer of met coal in the world, surpassed Japan a few years ago. But those met coal imports could well double by the end of the decade with all of this blast furnace development in India. So met coal by far the biggest winner. Where are they going to source that from? Of course, as we know, not a huge amount of met coal development going on globally. It's very difficult to develop and finance all these coal mines, as we've been discussing the last couple of days. So it's amazing to see the latest plans from India. When I met with the Steel Association last year, they just got back from Mongolia. I was saying, well, how are you going to get met coal from Mongolia? You're going to fly it out? Well, they just announced about a month ago they're going to invest in ports in Iran, and they're going to rail coal 7,500 kilometers from Mongolia across Russia, down through Georgia and Armenia, across Iran, and then it's only 4 or 5 days shipping into India. But 7,500 kilometers of rail, right? That's the kind of journey they're looking at. So the Iranians already import a lot of Russian commodities. Those rail lines exist. So it will also allow more Russian coal to start flowing that way. Can you imagine how much that's going to lift the cost curve? The logistics cost on that has got to be way over $100. And of course, the Mongolian coal is, again, it's not premium hard coking coal. Tavan Tolgoi got the good stuff, but the Chinese help fund the rail direct into that. It's only 80 k's from the Chinese border, so that won't be going that way. It's going to be other deposits will have to open up. So yeah, serious question marks for India. Where can they secure the met coal from longer term? But I'd say the met coal story and steel story in India are reasonably well known. Whereas I came away from India on a trip last year thinking, wow, copper and aluminium are where the real interest could be here. This is very underappreciated because, as I mentioned earlier, India doesn't really have a manufacturing base. They're just starting to build all these factories and build out the renewable energies. And you've got middle-class consumers coming through buying more electronics and all those kind of goods. So actually, India in steel, it's 140 million tonnes versus China at 1 billion tonnes. It's already 15% the size of China. Whereas for the base metals, India is generally less than 10% the size of China. So you're starting from a much lower base. And the steel demand's been growing at about a 10% CAGR last few years with all that infrastructure investment. I think that's very sustainable. Whereas the base metals, starting from a lower base, but I think the CAGR on the growth rates can be more like 15% plus because the investment levels are it's so strong in this renewable energy, and you've got the consumers developing so quickly as well. And yep, India. So in aluminium, India's pretty balanced. They produce about 4 million tons, but they export about 1.6 million of primary, import about 800 of products, and another couple of million of scrap. Copper as well. We had the biggest copper smelter in the world, started in India in the middle of this year, the Adani smelter, 500,000 tons. But otherwise, not many new primary smelters starting up or planned in India. So scrap is really the main beneficiary for India. But overall, India is 10% the size of China, we can call it. But China, I have base metals demand growing about 3% this year, might be a bit closer to 5%. Whereas India, 10% of the size, but it's growing at 15%. So actually, if you look at contribution to global growth, I've got China's going to be contributing about 1.5 basis points to global copper demand growth this year. But India is going to be contributing about 75 bips. About half the contribution of China. So yes, India is small versus China, only 10% of the size, but its contribution to incremental tonnage, consumption of things like copper and aluminium. I don't just think that India is a nice tailwind on a structural story now. I think we're getting to a point where that Indian demand can really start to make a difference to a lot of commodity markets. And of course, the other point on India is the seasonality there. Commodities have kind of, we've always had a bit of this sell in May, buy in September type seasonal trade in commodity markets. That, of course, matches the Indian monsoon season perfectly. So as India's dominance in commodity imports increases, that trade of seeing very strong markets, Q4, Q1, but then weakening around May every year, that could really increase. So yeah, I think it's not just a nice tailwind, it's something which can really start to make a difference sooner than people think. And I still think it's a very underappreciated story in the commodity markets. Because of course, right now, everyone's still very bearish on China. And that's kind of why commodities are not getting a great deal of love, because the China structural boom story is finished. China's in decline demographically. So, commodities can't surely look interesting with that backdrop. Tends to be the consensus view. But, there's interesting story in China here. We've really got a huge split between what I call the old economy and the new economy, right? So this all comes down to policies, essentially, and Xi's vision for China that was put in the constitution back in October last year. Xi's version of Chinese modernization. That's all about, we're going to upgrade industry, we're going to go high end, we're going to lead the world in technology, and you're seeing the fruitions of that in things like EVs and a lot of the technology China is leading the world in. But kind of Xi's dream was that we upgrade the industry, that creates all this high-paying new technologies and high-paying jobs, and then that feeds to stronger consumption. And that's the kind of linkage that's broken, because yes, the FAI is happening there, the upgrades are happening, the manufacturing is improving its efficiency and productivity, but as companies globally have experienced for the last 20 years, when you do that, you actually need less employees, not more. So that's where that kind of system is breaking down in China. If you're seeing the high-end tech development, you're seeing the FAI in manufacturing, in upgrading, but the consumer is miserable because the wage growth is just not there. The jobs growth is just not there. The follow-through is not there. And they did acknowledge that in the July Politburo meeting, which is why people are now thinking, are we finally going to get some proper stimulus or slight change of direction, because they finally admitted that feed-through to the consumer is just not there. And the other big negative, of course, is she's trying to remain very disciplined on infrastructure. So the big thing has been the clamping down on local government budgets. China's heavily indebted already, certainly at the local government level, with the lack of land sales and weak property markets. They've been very, very strict on that spending. So that's really hurt things like steel demand. I mean, cement demand this year is running down 11% year on year, double-digit decline. That's the best proxy for construction, because the government spending on infrastructure is down about 5 trillion RMB this year. So it's a newly signed construction contract. It's about 50 trillion. That was down 10% for this year. And housing markets as well, of course, still very negative. Basically, one of the stats I love on China, China's literally built, since they privatized the property market in 1999, they've built more than one apartment for every single urban family. right? Now in Western world, a lot of us live in 100-year-old buildings. China has literally built an entire housing stock in 25 years. So that's why the property market's gone pop, because they just built too much. And that's what the government's been saying. We've built far too much. We need to better utilize what we've got. We've got too many empty ones. We've got declining demographics. We don't need to build. So that is the big issue with the property market there. That's not going to rebound in volumes. The concern, of course, is prices. Stop the prices falling to stop hurting the consumer confidence. So yeah, we've really got this old economy, construction-oriented economy, infrastructure-oriented economy is in a terrible state. That's taken a big leg down this year. That's hit steel demand. It's hit iron ore. But actually, the green energy economy is still growing very well, right? EV sales are up 30%. Okay, total auto sales are not so good, but the EV sales still up 30% year on year. Renewable energy installation is there. The tech development's there. I mean, China's power consumption is still growing 5% this year. Okay, it's going to outpace GDP quite clearly this year. Now, one other interesting thing I'm thinking about on China at the moment is the environment coming back to take a bit more of a focal point. So China was getting, that was one of the big things Xi changed when he came in the mid-2010s. He said, one of the number one things everyone's unhappy with is the state of the environment, the air pollution. I'm going to clean that up. We're going to have a blue skies policy. And obviously they did an awful lot linked into supply side reforms, kind of killing multiple birds with one stone. But the environment was a big kind of overall driver. Let's clean up the air. Let's try and cut the pollution levels. And they did a very good job of that, right? The air's much improved versus how bad it was kind of early 2010s. But since COVID, there's been other priorities. And then with the weak economy as well, kind of environmentalism's fallen into the backdrop. But definitely picking up more chatter on that in policy circles in China, that the environment's starting to get a bit more interest. One of the interesting ones they did just a couple of weeks ago, actually, they finally confirmed the aluminium, cement and steel industries will be bought into the carbon market next year. So China launched its carbon market, and as we were discussing in the previous session there with Clive, the idea of Asia having a carbon price is definitely something that's starting to move. I'd say it's more driven by the Europeans with CBAM coming in, right, where Europe launched that on a trial basis since October last year, planning to start introducing taxes from 2026. They haven't had the discussions yet on how they're going to do that, but that's definitely prompting other countries like China. Oh, we better have a carbon price so we can sit there at the table with the Europeans and say, hey, we're paying for carbon, don't tax us on the imports. So I think that's one of the drivers for developing carbon prices in Asia is going to be kind of the trade angle into some of the Western markets that are further ahead in that carbon journey. So that's definitely an interesting development. Now, obviously, when China launched the carbon market in July 21 for the thermal power plants, they were given 95% free permits. It doesn't really raise the cost initially. I think the carbon price in China these days is about $12 a ton. It was $8 a couple of years ago. I think it has gone up a bit. So yes, bringing in steel, aluminium, cement, that's going to lift the costs for some of those. But I no doubt they will get an awful lot of free permits to start with. But this is a journey, and this is a very important narrative for aluminium, of course, because you've still got 60-70% of Chinese aluminium is thermal power based. And that's potentially up to 17 tons of carbon per ton of aluminium. So if China ultimately ended up with a European-style $100 carbon price, you could be looking at a global aluminium cost curve at $4,000. Now, it's not something I'm looking at on a 3 to 5 year horizon, but as a journey, where are we going if we start to factor in carbon prices? Aluminium's the one that would see the biggest change there. So that's definitely an interesting development that China's starting to come through on the carbon market. The other angle, last point there on the winter controls, that was always a big thing for things like the steel market, northeast China, where the air's bad, mid-November to mid-March, official winter heating season. So they tend to restrict some of the output. We haven't seen a great deal of that last couple of COVID-oriented years, but that's going to be interesting as we go into November this year. Could that be a tool perhaps to try and help the steel industry out? Steel mills have cut production aggressively with the bad margins. And, normally it's the government imposing restrictions on industries that industries don't like, but actually in the steel industry in China, you've got the industry lobbying the government for more restrictions, saying we fondly remember the days of supply side reforms. We were making huge margins back then. Please, can you bring back some of these policies and publicly talk about restricting? We're glad to cut production if it means we have big margins again. So yeah, watch out for more developments on that, because I think that's definitely becoming a thing. So yeah, as I said, the weaker sides there on the infrastructure side of things. Manufacturing, headline manufacturing FAI is good, but that's not building new plants. It's upgrading with all of these plans to upgrade the manufacturing going high end. So again, that's not creating steel and cement demand. It's more technology and systems. And yet the consumer equally very, very weak. That's another point of weakness that they're trying to battle against in China. Globally as well, I realize I'm waffling on a bit here, so I'll speed it up. Globally, there's quite a bit of hope that finally, after a 2-year destocking cycle on the global commodities demand, that we could see a bit of recovery this year. Those hopes clearly having been dashed in the last few months. Global demand, economies, worries about the US, Europe just perennially struggling. So hopes that the rest of the world would contribute to more commodity demand this year seem to have again faded away. So we really are just India and China, I think, the dominant forces still. So in terms of the base metals, so yeah, with this split between the old economy and the new economy in China, I have steel demand at the start of the year, I said will be down 3% plus. It's actually looking like it's down 5%. But I was still saying we're going to get growth in copper and aluminium consumption, which should be 3% plus. And again, that's actually looking more like 5%. So that split between old economy materials, new economy materials, it's just very much widening within China there. So copper and aluminium demand still clearly growing. Now, yes, the base metal market's very worried about all these inventories in LME warehouses, and China exported lots of copper in 2Q and all of that. But a lot of that was just price arbitrage, right? Global prices were sky high. The Chinese consumers were saying, whoa, I'm not paying those prices, thanks very much. So actually it was end user destocking was offsetting that visible inventory rise and the increase in Chinese exports. And actually since then, since about the end of June, Chinese visible inventory of copper inventory through the chain is down around 300,000 tons. While the LME inventory is up about 150,000 tons. So actually, the demand is there, the consumption's there, and of course with the lack of concentrates, China's smelters are really constrained in how much they can produce. So I still think the copper market, it's tight this year, it's going to be tight next year and going forward. So I still like copper here. I think the price has got a lot of kind of macro pessimism factoring into it. Aluminium looks very interesting with alumina. The alumina price has been over $500 now, or over $480 at least for the last 3 months. That's a very different market to what it used to be. It used to be China, if there was an alumina price spike, China had no shortage of bauxite, millions of excess tons of refinery capacity, and they'd switch on like that and you'd see exports. That's completely changed. I mean, again, it's post-COVID, iron ore, bauxite, zinc, you can't mine anything in China. Those cost curves have entirely lost their elasticity. There's no reaction to price anymore because environmental legislation, all of that, you can't switch on kind of a new mine, or you can't have illegal, unofficial mines coming through. So the raw materials are tight for everything there, copper, zinc, bauxite, and that's really feeding through to constraints on smelter production. So with the underlying growth in the green energy consumption, I think that's where the prices can do well for the base metals there. Battery materials, now that's one which has seen massive supply growth. And yes, in China, the demand's doing well. Like I said, with the cash for clunkers kind of EV upgrade programs in China, you've got headline auto sales are actually down slightly this year, but EV sales are still up 30%. So the EV story in China is still going gangbusters, but outside of China, that's where the weakness has come through, with a notable slowdown in kind of ex-China EV demand. And we've just got far too much supply coming through, both of nickel out of Indonesia, and then on the lithium side, all these Chinese investments throughout Africa and elsewhere on top of the kind of merchant market investments that we're seeing coming through. So yeah, prices have done very poorly for nickel and lithium. I'd say we're pushing into cost curves. You've certainly seen closures of some kind of traditional refined nickel producers globally this year. You're starting to see a few closures on the lithium side as well at these levels. But I worry we've still got a lot of supply coming through. Indonesia, by the end of next year, is going to be 2.5 million tons of nickel units. That's 2/3 of global supply from nothing 10 years ago. It's astonishing, the development in Indonesia. And lithium as well, 33% supply growth this year. I've still got another 25% coming through next year. Now, Chinese EV demand may be 25%, but the global demand's not going to be that high. So still, I think These markets are suffering. Prices are starting to cause curtailments, but I don't think we're anywhere near digesting that supply. It's still going to remain a challenging year for those next year. And on the steel side of things, yeah, that's also been terrible with this backdrop, as I said, in Chinese construction markets. But China's steel mills have responded aggressively. The production cuts, I mean, August production was down 10% year on year, weakest since 2017. So I think steel as well, through the worst now. I think as Indian demand comes back through monsoon season, we should see kind of global steel prices doing a bit better through the fourth quarter. And iron ore, steel exports as well in China, they've kind of capped out now. That's been something China's fallen back on to keep its economy alive through last year. I mean, China's flooded the world with steel, with solar panels, with EVs. This year, we've started to see a backlash against that. I think there's 60-odd trade cases against Chinese steel globally. So the steel exports look like they did peak in March. They're gradually coming off now. So again, I think that's why global steel prices have digested all of these Chinese exports. You're not going to see any more pressure from that. China's cut steel production. Indian demand comes through. So I think steel prices can look a bit better by the end of the year and into next year. But I still, in terms of the steel raw materials, I think met coal phenomenally tight because of the India story, but iron ore, I think, kind of decimated now, and that's coming into it's a very bad period for iron ore, where prices have finally broken down below $100. But we've got supply growth of iron ore was 70 million tons last year. It's another 60-odd million globally this year, and then we've got finally this West Africa hub in Guinea coming through with Simandou kicking off at the end of next year. Whereas that Chinese steel production is just going to be down and down and down now. So the iron ore market looks structurally very oversupplied here. So I've been saying cost support to me lies more around $80, not $100. I think that's where the price should be settling. But of course, the big question is grade spreads. The reason I say cost for iron ore should be about 80%, should be about $80 for the 62 equivalent, is because the low grade supply, where the growth has been, is actually trading at a narrow discount because mills are not making much money. Whereas structurally longer term, as we move to green steel, if we move to more kind of demand for the higher quality, cleaner iron ores, then we could well see an expansion in some of those grade spreads, where actually the higher quality iron ores hold up okay. The pain will really be felt just by the low quality ones. All right, thanks. Cheers.